someone said something to you, maybe a week ago, maybe a month, maybe years, and you still remember the exact words, the exact tone, the exact expression on their face. It wasn't a catastrophe. It wasn't violence. It was one sentence, maybe even said carelessly, without intention. And you answered calmly. You smiled. You walked away. And then, somewhere between that moment and tonight, you started the conversation over. In the shower. In the car. In that specific corridor of the mind that opens up at 2 a.m. when everything else is quiet. You replayed it. You answered better this time. You said the thing you should have said. You won, and then you played it again, and won again, and again. The person who said it has forgotten. They moved on before the echo reached you. But you are still in that room, still in that exchange, still bleeding from a wound that, if you measured it honestly, was never more than a scratch. Here is what I need you to understand before we go any further. You are not destroyed by what happened. You are being destroyed by what you do with it every night after. The bite was small. The running is what kills you. And today we look at exactly why and exactly how to stop. In Africa, wild horses rest standing up. They don't lie down, and in the dark, vampire bats come. They land softly, make a small incision, take what they need, and leave. The wound itself is minor. It causes no serious damage. The horse loses almost nothing. But the horse panics. It feels the bite, registers threat, and runs. Hard, fast. For a long time, long after the bat is gone, long after the danger has passed, the horse is still running, burning through energy reserves that were never meant for a sprint of this length. The horse doesn't die from the bite. It dies from the exhaustion of its own uncontrolled response to something that was already over. Now consider the snake. A saw is lying in the grass, motionless, passive. Just an object on the ground. The snake crosses it and feels a small cut. The pain is real, the wound is real, but it is small. The snake, however, does not treat it as small. Something ignites. The snake turns, locates the source, and attacks, biting the blade of the saw with full force. The saw is metal. The saw is pointed. And with every bite, the snake tears itself apart, trying to destroy something that was never even alive enough to be its enemy. What killed the snake was not the saw. The saw didn't move. The saw didn't chase it. What killed the snake was the decision to treat a small wound as a declaration of war. This is happening inside you. When an offense lands, a dismissal, a criticism, a cruel word from someone who may not have even meant it, your nervous system responds as if the threat is still present. Your brain cannot distinguish between a memory of pain and actual pain. Every time you replay the incident, your body relives it. Cortisol, elevated heart rate, muscular tension, real biological stress, generated entirely from inside, about an event that is no longer happening. The person who hurt you has moved on. You are still fighting them, and the only one getting cut is you. Psychologists call this rumination, the mind locked in a loop, returning again and again to the same injury, each pass deepening the groove, each repetition making the neural pathway stronger. What begins as a wound becomes a scar. What begins as a scar becomes a lens, and suddenly you are seeing everything through the distortion of that one original hurt. The problem was never the bite. The problem is that you have been running ever since. 2,500 years ago, in ancient Greece, a man who had been born into slavery, who had experienced what real powerlessness actually feels like, sat down and wrote something that cuts through everything. People are disturbed not by things, but by their opinions about things. His name was Epictetus. He had no political power, no wealth, no external freedom for much of his life. And yet he developed a philosophy of radical internal sovereignty, not the sovereignty of someone who controls the world, the sovereignty of someone who has drawn a precise line between what belongs to him and what does not. That line is the central technology of Stoicism. On one side, what happens to you? The bat bites. The person says the word. The circumstance arrives without your permission. This side is not yours. You cannot control it. Fighting it is like the snake attacking the saw. The object doesn't move. Only you bleed. On the other side, what you do with it. Your interpretation. Your decision about what this event means. Your choice of how long it lives inside you. This side is entirely yours, always. Even in the worst circumstances, this is the one thing no external force can take from you. Epictetus called it the hegemonikon, the governing faculty. The part of you that decides what enters and what doesn't, not what happens, what you allow to take up precedence. And Seneca, the Roman philosopher who watched emperors rise and fall and spent years navigating a world of real violence and real betrayal, wrote something even more precise. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. Read that again. Not that the pain isn't real, not that you should pretend the wound didn't happen, but that the wound, the actual bite, almost never matches the scale of suffering that follows it. The bat takes a small amount of blood, the imagination takes everything else. Now go further east. Across centuries and continents, a different tradition arrived at exactly the same place, through a different metaphor. The Buddha taught what is called the doctrine of the two arrows. The first arrow is pain that life delivers, unavoidable, inevitable. Someone speaks unkindly. You fail at something you cared about. You are misunderstood by someone whose opinion mattered. The first arrow lands. You cannot stop it. It is part of the architecture of being alive. The second arrow is what you do afterward. The second arrow is the self-inflicted wound, the replaying, the resentment, the internal prosecution, the 2 a.m. loop that reopens the entry wound every time it was about to close. The first arrow is shot by the world. The second arrow you load and fire yourself into yourself repeatedly. And this is what no one tells you when they say, just let it go. Letting go is not about forgiving the person who hurt you. That may be part of it, but it is secondary. The real act, the harder act, is to stop being the version of yourself that keeps firing. To recognize that the person you need to release is not them. It is the self that has been holding the bow at its own chest for days, weeks, sometimes years, convinced that this is the only way to keep the wound alive. Because if the wound closes, something else will have to be felt instead. Here is the thing that lives underneath all of this. Sometimes we don't want to let go. Not because we're weak, not because we lack the philosophy, but because staying in the wound feels like the last connection to the event. Like if we stop being hurt, it means it didn't matter. Like if the anger dissolves, the person who caused it wins. Like the rumination is a form of loyalty to the version of ourselves that deserved better. This is the mask. The mask is this. That holding on to the pain is somehow protecting you. That the anger is armor. That keeping the record of every wrong is a form of self-respect. But armor that you can't take off becomes a cage. And the record of every wrong is not a shield. It is a weight you carry alone, while the person who wronged you sleeps without thinking of you at all. The illusion is that your suffering holds them accountable. That somewhere they feel it. That your 2 a.m. loop somehow reaches them and lands. It doesn't. The only person in the room for that conversation, every single time, is you. This is the practice. Not a philosophy, a practice The next time the loop begins, the next time the replay starts and the internal argument reopens, do not try to stop it with force. Do not try to forgive immediately. Do not try to manufacture peace you don't feel. Instead, observe it. Step back inside yourself and look at the loop as a scientist looks at a specimen. Name it out loud if you have to. This is the second arrow. I am firing it into myself, not as self-criticism, as information, as a precise description of the mechanism that is running. That act of naming, of watching yourself inside the loop rather than being unconsciously inside it, creates distance. And distance is everything. Distance is the difference between a man drowning and a man watching the water. The Stoics called this the observer position. Epictetus practiced it under conditions most of us will never face, the capacity to watch your own reactions without being owned by them. Not to eliminate the reaction, to see it clearly enough that you can choose what happens next, then ask one question. Is this the second arrow? If yes, you already know what to do. Not because someone told you to forgive, but because you finally see that the only person being cut by the blade is you, and you are tired of bleeding for a wound that closed long ago in everyone else's world. You draw the boundary, not against them, against the version of yourself that insists on suffering. That is the real boundary, the one that actually holds. Go to the comments, tell me about your second arrow, not the thing that happened. Tell me how long you have been carrying it. One sentence. I read everything. I respond to everything. Because this is the conversation most people are having alone at 2 a.m. And it doesn't have to be. The horse didn't die from the bite. The snake didn't die from the saw. They died from the decision. Made in a fraction of a second, made automatically, made without knowing there was another option. To treat a small wound as an existential war. You've been at war with something that stopped moving a long time ago. Today you saw the mechanism. The first arrow, the second arrow, the loop that runs in the dark and calls itself justice when it is really just exhaustion. You don't have to keep running. The bat is gone. But here is the question that waits on the other side of this. If you stop reacting to what others do to you, you will have to sit with something much quieter and much harder, because underneath the anger, underneath the loop, underneath every second arrow you've ever fired, there is a wound that came before all of them, one that was there before anyone said anything, one that made you ready to bleed from a scratch. Where did that readiness come from? That is the next room, and the door has always been there.